Commandments. There are 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible. They were meant only for Israel, not for everybody else. They were how Israel was to maintain a separate identity from other religious ethnic groups. And it was to help them live in covenant relationship with God and neighbor and self. It was not, though, a buffet of laws. It was all or nothing. So you couldn't say, I'm going to keep, number 7, number 27, number 77, and number 507. It was all or nothing. So why do we want to keep just 2? And besides, I think somebody named Paul said that Christians are no longer bound by 613 commandments, but we want to make a few of them still binding. A little bit about the book of Leviticus. It's about teachings for the priests as well as teachings for the people. A lot is about liturgy and how to do cultic worship. Others are about proper behavior, how to be holy as the Lord your God is holy. There are only 2 narratives in the entire book. Most of it's just the commandments. Chapters 1 through 16 addressed to priests, 17 through 27 to the rest of the people. Our 2 passages in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 come from what has been identified as the holiness code. And it has a lot of behaviors that are primarily prohibited or they are required. So you have in the holiness code, a child who curses or sasses a parent should be killed. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be here today if we still wanted to carry out that law. Anyone guilty of adultery was to be killed. Hollywood and D.C. may be a little smaller populations if that were carried out. A daughter of a priest who engages in prostitution is to be killed. Anyone who uses the Lord's name in vain is to be killed. There we go. You thought you were safe on that one, and then darn, got me there. The Holiness Code also prohibits having heterosexual intercourse with a menstruating woman. Harvesting the corners of your field. You're supposed to leave some behind as that sort of food bank. Crossbreeding livestock. Eating fruit from a young tree. Tattoos. No tattoos. Charging interest on a loan is not allowed. Now, we like that one, but my mortgage company will not see fit to follow that commandment. And I can't pick and choose because that's problematic. All right, our 2 texts. Leviticus 18:22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. And Leviticus 20:13, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Here's a more wooden translation. With a male, you, which is a male, shall not lie the lying of a woman. And it happens that way in both of those texts. Now, why do I highlight that? Well, remember I said that the worst thing for men in that ancient world was to be treated like a woman. And as Israel understood it, there were givers and there were receivers. I won't get more graphic. I could draw you pictures, but I won't. And so if the man is forced into the receiving position, he's being treated like a woman, and that is a terrible, terrible insult in a patriarchal world. I hope we've moved past that. The other thing that's clearly of concern here is wasting seed. That seed should be put into a field that could produce a child. Now, the good news about Leviticus is that lesbianism is okay. I usually get a hallelujah, whatever. There is no prohibition against lesbianism. Why? Well, either they didn't care or there's no waste of seed. And as I said, it's about men being treated like a woman. That's 2 out of 613. This word abomination gets a lot of play, like it's the worst sin ever. And I actually heard a minister call one of my friends who identified as lesbian, "You are an abomination." So, the Hebrew word is to'avah, and it has to do with things that bring about ritual impurity. So when we look at things that are called to'avah, we realize that doesn't mean the worst sin. In fact, according to the commandments, all sins are sins. There's not a hierarchy. Other things considered to'avah: eating a sacrifice at the wrong time, eating pork or shellfish. So if you had bacon, that's an abomination. Seeing a menstruating woman naked, that's a to'avah. And actually, there's a text that if you eat with an Egyptian, it's a to'avah. So you see, the word doesn't mean this is God's pet peeve. And in fact, I like to remind people that, remember that second greatest commandment, Leviticus 19? You know, when Jesus was asked that question, he could have gone to Leviticus 18 or Leviticus 20. But he reached into the middle and pulled out, love your neighbor. Think if that was God's chief sin, Jesus would have known about it. So we're moving into the New Testament. Sex in the New Testament. During the writing of the New Testament, the followers of Jesus were trying to get established as a new religion. Judaism had some street cred, but Christianity had not won its place in the Greco-Roman culture. So they were always in danger of being, how do I want to put this, of losing their identity, of being brought back into a Greco-Roman religious world. Assimilation was the greatest threat. So what we see in those early Christian leaders and people like Paul, who was not a Christian, but he's been used to help develop the church, is that anything that looked, smelled, or tasted like Greek religion had to be condemned, and you could have no part of it. Things like sacred prostitutes, fertility rituals, all those things that were part of Greco-Roman culture, followers of Jesus had to stay away from. So some of what we find in Paul's writings were like, really? I need to have long hair? Well, I don't get that. Well, in context, it talked about how hair on women was a sign of prostitution often if you had a shaved head. So there are a lot of cultural things that we miss as we're reading the New Testament. The first text we come to is Romans 1, 26 to 27. In this passage, Jesus is talking about people who have started following idols. And as a result of their idolatry, things go haywire. It's complete chaos. And so he says, for this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. Same way the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. First off, this is not, again, about relationships. Probably what we see being described here is an orgy. And that's bad no matter how you look at it in Paul's mind. The other thing that we need to look at is, what about this word unnatural? In Greek, it's paraphizin. And it actually is a word that's most often translated as unconventional. So as I said, men with long hair was paraphizin, unnatural. Exact same word. But we would never think of long hair on men as something we should condemn. At least I wouldn't. I hope nobody else would. Again, this kind of pagan fertility ritual orgy is some of what we think may have been going on that Paul wanted to prevent the Christians from getting involved with. And so, because these people were guilty of idolatry, their behavior became problematic. But again, it wasn't that they were behaving in ways that was about sexual attraction and healthy relationships. And in some ways, if he infers that they're all heterosexual, then it's about them going against their nature, which is problematic. One might ask then, if someone is born gay, lesbian, whatever, if we require them to go against their nature, isn't that the same problem? There are two texts, 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, and 1 Timothy, I think that's 9 and 10 and not 1 and 10. These are both what we call sin inventories. Paul is talking about in Corinthians, and then the writer of Timothy later is talking about who's not going to make it into heaven. So in 1 Corinthians, we read that fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none will get into heaven. Now, everybody wants to point to one word there, but they ignore that greedy part. And I have to admit, that steps on my toes. And the basic same thing happens in 1 Timothy, where it says that, the lawless, disobedient, the godless, the sinful, the unholy, profane, kill their father and mother, murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching will keep you out of the kingdom of God. Now, I italicized sodomites for a reason. If you go, this is the New Revised Standard Version. If you go to the Revised Standard Version or the King James Version, you will not find the word sodomite there. You will often have male prostitutes and sexual perverts or soft men, effeminate men. Actually, the word there is more about being soft as in lazy, but you could see why we wouldn't want to put lazy in there. And actually, the word here translated as sodomite in the New Revised Standard Version is arsenokoitai. And you don't know Greek, but you know that doesn't sound anything like Sodom. The word is hard to translate. It has something to do with beds and males. So it sometimes had been understood as male prostitutes, or maybe the lazy men. When the New Revised Standard Version was being translated as a committee, an ecumenical interfaith committee, I know that these two texts were debated because some people wanted to put sodomite in there, even though they knew that had nothing to do with it. And other people didn't. And I happen to have known one of the translators who shared with me that this was a tit-for-tat decision. We'll let you have sodomite here if you let us have something somewhere else. Politics. That's how it got in there. So if you see sodomite, you see homosexual. That is not in the text. It is in clear. Every translation is an interpretation, but that's more than just an interpretation. That's, to me, unfaithful to the text. So I just went through all that. And then the last one is Jude 7. If you haven't read Jude, it doesn't have chapters. So it's just Jude 1 or Jude 2, not Jude chapter 7. And it talks about how Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, in the same manner as they, indulged in sexual immorality. I would say gang rape is sexual immorality. And pursued unnatural lust. Now, the interesting thing here is the writer of Jude knows the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and know that the people they wanted brought out were actually angels. And in the ancient world, for Christians and for Israel, humans didn't have sex with angels. That's the unnatural lust that's going on there. If you wonder why that's prohibited, go back and read one of the reasons why the flood happened. Because divine beings are having sex with human women. Those are all the texts, folks. That's it. There's not anything else out of all the verses of the Bible. And I think once we look at them in context and what they actually have written down and how they need to be understood by genre and by when, where, and why, we can see that the Bible, when people say, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? I typically say nothing. Because again, they don't talk about people and their sexual orientation and people who are naturally drawn to same-sex individuals or both-sex individuals. There are at least a few sex-friendly texts. I like to throw this out so you don't give up on the Bible. Song of Songs, I mentioned before, it's about this sexual relationship between two people. They are a man and a woman, but the text indicates that their relationship is not approved of by the society. And in fact, there's one chapter where the woman goes looking for her lover at night in the streets, and she's found in the wrong place and beaten up. And that brings to mind for me too many stories about hate crimes. Ruth, oh come on now. When we sing Whither Thou Goest at a wedding, most people don't know that that was said by one woman to another woman. A daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law, and I love my mother-in-law. I would not promise to go anywhere she goes and all that good stuff. And actually, to me, the story of Ruth and Naomi is about two women who try to make it by themselves in a male-dominated world. And in order to have a future, they have to have a male person in their lives. So they orchestrate and seduce Boaz into marrying Ruth and impregnating her. But once that boy child is born, Boaz is gone from the story. And it's just Ruth and Naomi and Obed and the women of the city who tell Naomi that Ruth was worth more to her than 7 sons. Similar words are said by Hannah's husband when she is sad because she can't have children. I have this sense that because Ruth did what she needed to do and produced an offspring, a male offspring, they could be left alone. Now, I once had someone say, "Are you telling me Ruth and Naomi had lesbian sex?" And I said, "I don't know." Well, you used the word intimacy. Well, yeah, they have an intimate relationship, but when I say intimate, I don't necessarily mean physical sex. Maybe you need to rethink your definition. That's another story. Jonathan and David. Yes, David was known for his many wives, but that's what kings did in the ancient Near East. The only healthy relationship he ever had was with Saul's son, Jonathan. Jonathan betrayed his father for David. And it said that their very being, their nephashim, that which is who you are, were bound together. It's very similar to the language of, therefore a man shall leave his mother and father and be bound with his woman. And we know that when Jonathan was killed, David lamented Jonathan in a song and even says that his love was more to him than the love of any woman. So sometimes I think we're reading back into the biblical text more biased than might have been there to start out with. Because these biblical writers were comfortable writing about these intimate same-sex relationships. And it's only when we come along with our Western mindset about either or and everything's a binary that we start making their problems perhaps where originally there weren't the same problems. All right, that's all I have. I want to leave a little time for questions and comments and anything else I left out or you'd like to add. Yes, John?
You didn't say anything about what Jesus said about this topic.
Well, that's because he said nothing about this topic. Said a lot about not judging, a lot about greed and giving away all you had and giving it to the poor. I mean, but nothing about that.